Welcome everybody on this beautiful, beautiful spring day. My name is Rob Doubleday, Executive Director of the Centre for Science and Policy, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here to our Annual Cleevely Lecture. And it's an opportunity that we relish to recognise and honour David Cleevely, who founded Centre for Science and Policy in 2009, 17 years ago. How did that happen? 17 years ago. So I know we'll come to that, don't worry, we'll come to that. And, you know, David put so much energy and vision into establishing CSaP, and what is good and effective and special about CSaP today is very much due to that energy that David put in. And I always repeat that through David's initiation, CSaP is striving towards is really making the university's mission to serve society a reality. And to do that by starting to ask, what do people outside the university want and need from the university? To think about bringing those questions in, and for us at the Centre for Science and Policy, that is people working in government, policy fellows, and it's always lovely to have policy fellows in the audience. We have several of you here, so thank you. Coming in through the Centre for Science and Policy with questions, needs that then we can curate conversations, meetings to connect them to the academics that have so much valuable insight and expertise to share. So it's through that connecting, convening, networking, responding to the needs of people working in public policy that we think we are helping the academic world really achieve its mission. And so we're very grateful, David, to you for starting us down this road. And you know, a great way if you're inspired by me, in that little story of how CSaP was established, you would certainly be very interested in David's new book. It's still new, because when we had this annual lecture last year, it hadn't been published. And now those that know David Cleevely know he's rather shy and retiring. So he wouldn't want to plug his book, so I will do it for him. Serendipity, It Doesn't Happen by Accident. Great book that talks about some of the principles that really underlie what CSaP does. So this is our annual lecture. We really enjoy it as an opportunity to bring together members of our network, people from government, people from the academic world, to hear from really outstanding practitioners, I mean, many other things as well as a practitioner, but practitioners who have, through their career, linked these worlds together. And it's become a tradition that we invite chief scientific advisors from the UK government to speak. So we've had John Beddington, Mark Walpott, and Angela McLean. And it's great to have David King here in the audience, who at the time that CSaP was established was no longer chief scientific advisor, but is in that great tradition. And we've also had Chris Whitty and Sally Davies. And we've also had a number of really remarkably effective and interesting departmental chief scientific advisors. And we are really pleased this year to be welcoming Jennifer Rubin, who until recently was the chief scientific advisor at the Home Office. Now, Jennifer CSaP has benefited very much from working with Jennifer for as long as CSaP has been around. So back in 2009, Jennifer was helping run RAND Europe, and worked to help connect RAND Europe and their expertise with the Centre for Science and Policy. She then went on to and ended up running the King's Policy Institute, and CSaP and King's have a very close relationship, which we continue to this day. And then, as you'll hear, went on to run ESRC and then the Home Office. So throughout that, Jennifer, you've been a great colleague, an inspiring colleague, and we couldn't think of anyone better to invite to give the 2006 Annual Cleevely Lecture. Jennifer.
Thank you so much, Rob, for that kind introduction, and it's wonderful to see you all here this evening. Can I just check, is the mic working? Is everything as it should be? Wonderful. And now for my technological skills. Let's see, I'm finding my own slides. Yep, got them. We're not done yet, so I'll go to the beginning. Sorry. That was the quickest talk ever, wasn't it? Let's see if we can get that right. Excellent. Here we are. So, as I said, it's fantastic to have you all here, and thank you so much. I feel really honored, both, first of all, to be called a practitioner by Rob and CSaP, because I know how important that work is. It's not just a practitioner, it's a practitioner. Hurrah. And also to see you all here tonight when it's like glorious sunshine, talk about science advice. So, yeah, well done, and thank you so much for coming for this talk. So I've switched my title a little bit from a day or 5 years in the life of a chief scientific advisor, because that's really how long it was. And you'll be pleased to know I'm not actually going to do a day in the life. So I'm not, that mainly was lots of meetings, lots of coffee, brilliant colleagues, some of whom are here. But I will talk about life as a chief scientific advisor. So it's also brilliant to be here back where my research journey began. So it feels like a nice sort of circularity somehow, and thinking about what more can be done in this space. I want to do 3 main things tonight. I'll start not with my own story, but with an even older one, because mine's, I'm getting there. But it's one that I think tells us something worthwhile about why the role I had existed. And actually, I should be showing you, there we go, why the role I had existed, and a little bit about what we can take forward about why it continues to evolve and how important that will be. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about my own trajectory, because I was told to do so, because apparently it's unusual and interesting. I think you would call me a boundary spanner is probably the politest term for what I've done, moving from one bit to another of the landscape. And then finally, I'll focus in on a little bit about what I think I found in terms of actually being the practitioner, being in the role of the Chief Scientific Advisor at the Home Office, and a few reflections about what I think that tells us about bridging or trying to bridge. And I'll be really interested. There are so many of you in the room who also have interesting, important experiences on this, so I'm really looking forward to the discussion as well. So, that's not moving, there we go. So, the even older story. In 2009, the historian Lucy Chappell gave the C.P. Snow Lecture at Christ's College, which was Snow's own college, on the 50th anniversary of his famous Reed Lecture on the 2 cultures and the scientific revolution. Jardines' argument was that most people have read the 2 cultures as the opening shot in a long, long debate about the relationship between the sciences and the humanities. It was Snow's shorthand for what he saw as a really dangerous divide between those who were the sort of literary and classical formation of those who were making decisions in public life, and the scientific training of those who were doing the science that was informing some of the really tough, important decisions. Well, Snow himself was actually a boundary spanner. He was a scientist, a novelist, and a civil servant. And Jardine said that he actually saw the problem of the 2 cultures as the formulation of a problem that had bothered him since his time in Whitehall, which was how does government get the really deep, important science advice that it needs when it's making really difficult questions. And he was referring back to the sort of life and death questions in war at the time, but it was a broader point. So he illustrated this through what he considered a cautionary tale about 2 scientists, 2 very different relationships with power, and a very poor decision that ensued with some serious consequences. Many of you will probably know the story, given this audience, so I'll try to just summarize quickly a few points of it for those of you who do not. Henry Tizard was a chemist interested in aeronautics and an inventor who had in the run-up to World War II, had actually been asked by the Labour government to set up a scientific committee that would advise on what was the best way to protect Britain from air attack. And he did that. The committee recommended that the as yet unproven radar should be the thing that was going to be invested in. They succeeded in persuading their audience, and that was where investment fell. And that was the preferred course of action, to very good effect, it turned out, despite some strongly opposing it, and one in particular. And that was Frederick Lindemann, later Lord Cherwell, And he had once been a friend of Tizard until they fell out irrevocably on this committee. Lindman himself was a physicist, and he was very close to Churchill. And as Churchill came to power, he became his incredibly strongly relied upon personal scientific advisor. Now, the decision in question was a debate that arose around the time during World War II, and it was a debate about the extensive bombing campaign to take out strategic German targets during the war. And really great political hopes and military hopes had been pinned on this being the thing that would turn things around. But by March 1942, the scale of the failure of that strategic bombing campaign was very, very clear. I think they were hitting about 5% of the target, so it was really not going well and losing a lot of people and machinery. So they needed to change tack, and this was increasingly recognized. Lindman gave Churchill a memo arguing for a shift to what was called area bombing, or dehousing is the kind of horrible term that ended up being used for it, estimating the likely effect of German housing stock of a kind of blanket bombing campaign. So mainly focusing on bombing densely populated areas. So this memo had the calculation in it saying that it would be possible to destroy more than 50% of all houses in the principal German cities. Tizard challenged Lindman's analysis, as did another scientist, Patrick Blackett, who was a physicist and operations researcher. They estimated that their analysis showed that the estimate was 5 and 6 times too high, respectively. Well, Snow's post-war assessment from the US Strategic Bombing Survey showed that it had actually turned out to be 10 times too high. But at the time, there were very strong forces mitigating against challenge. So first, there had been, as I said, very significant emotional and financial investment into air operations over other possible routes, and that was over a period of years. And this proposed strategy allowed a kind of pivot within the air focus rather than to a completely new route. Second, Lindman was very, very close to Churchill, very close and recognizably powerful to others around. And there was no strong, separate institutional mechanism that would have brought in the challenge and made sure it was heard and taken seriously. And third, there was also just a really strong desire to do something following the Blitz and actually to sort of strike back, if you like. Oh, well and good, or not so good, actually, but there is another dimension to the story that I want to draw out. And that's that the rationale for the revised strategic bombing, or dehousing strategy, was fundamentally, explicitly behavioral in what it was trying to achieve. Lindman focused on its impact on morale. Human psychology, it rested on specific assumptions about human psychology. He said that having one's house demolished is most damaging to morale. People seem to mind it more than having friends or even their family killed. Well, the prediction implicit in that was about not only the psychology, but the behavior that would ensue. Break the housing, break the spirit, break the will to sustain the war and resistance. Now, some of you may have noticed that so far I've talked about physicists, some operations research, a chemist. Several of them put forward their own views and intuitions about the impact of the area bombing strategy, or that it was likely to have. But actually, I've looked through, and please do in the discussion, somebody raise this if they have, I've not been able to find any reference to a psychologist or a psychiatrist who might know something about the impact of that kind of experience on morale. There were researchers actually in the wider landscape who were, at the time, advancing study of the impact of bombing on civilian populations and on morale, and they were looking at the impact, for example, of recent German bombing in the UK. Some did raise doubts about whether the UK bombing the bombing in the UK had cracked population morale, but the process of decision-making not only didn't draw in other people's challenges, it was also really not tuned to do so across the breadth of the types of scientific advice that they needed to do that well, I would argue. So not only was the flawed estimate one of the things that held sway, but the flawed sort of assumption, if you like, the underlying assumption about its impact on behavior also held sway. Now, we now know that the impact on German morale was nothing like what was expected. It was far more complex and conditional, and actually turned out that under continuous heavy bombing, you don't get proportional decreases in morale. In fact, lots of things can mitigate that and even support resilience in a population under bombardment. And we've definitely observed something very strikingly similar in a very different context, but very current one, with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia in 2022. And there, the actual strategy was very similar, and the intention was very similar as well. Destroy homes and civilian life, break the will of the population, undermine their resistance. But survey research in Ukraine has found something very similar to what happened in Germany, if not more so, and that it actually seems to have strengthened Ukrainian resistance, and rather than weakening it, and optimism is still a very strong feature of the Ukrainian population. So, my point is really not about military outcomes or the ethics of these strategies, though these are certainly super important and lots of people have studied them in detail. In the context of this evening, it's really about knowledge gaps and whether and how they're surfaced and addressed. The question of whether and how a particular population will actually respond to a proposed strategy or intervention, and why, wasn't really asked with a lot of rigor in 1942. And while we have actually done better in many ways and at many moments since then, it's not always the case, so it's worth just bearing in mind. So a few takeaways from that before we move on. The first you'll have gathered is about the structure of scientific advice. The problems now identified, the powerful lone voice that held sway, the absence of structured mechanisms for surfacing challenge, those were really important parts of the context in which the formal government chief scientific advisor role has evolved in this country. The good news is that what has been constructed since, and the role that some of you present have held, since Solly Zuckerman's appointment in 1964, has come a really long way. And slightly more recently, Bob May summed up well the lessons from this story and from the BSE crisis. In his guidelines, he set out actually when he became chief scientific advisor to the Major government in the 1990s. He said, when making decisions in an area where the science is uncertain, get together the best group of scientists in the relevant area. He said, solicit dissenting views, surface interests and make them explicit, be transparent, and emphasize uncertainties. All very good. And the government chief scientific advisor and the network of departmental CSAs, the PM's Council on the Prime Minister's Council on Science and Technology, the departmental chief scientific advisors, the explicit design of the role of chief scientific advisor as a challenge function, not merely an advisory one. All of these represent a really kind of sustained institutional response, if you like, to some of those lessons and more since. Now, where and when these people and these mechanisms are empowered, they're present in the room, and they work well, this is really major progress, of course. Also important, though, is the scope of what is considered to be the relevant science from that first bullet point, because that scope also shapes what are considered to be the right questions to be asking before something is pursued. So, understanding through empirical research, testing and evaluation, how people are actually likely to respond to something, the psychology of their decision-making, the sociology of how practices spread through and may differentially impact communities and institutions, the economics of the incentive structures that they face, and the anthropology of different cultural beliefs and practices, and so much more. These, I think, are not downstream communication problems to be addressed once a strategy or technology has been devised and ready to go. They should inform from the outset the framing that are questions about those challenges, as well as the development of the strategies to address them. I would argue they need to be in the room from the beginning I'm really delighted that when I was, this was thought to be the case when I was chosen to be the Home Office's Chief Scientific Advisor, and that those areas were thought to be very important there. So the further good news is that the wider range of expertise that's needed is also increasingly evident in how we think about crisis preparedness and response, and indeed in the whole array of wider areas that governments are designing policies, whether trying to improve outcomes in health or security or economic life or beyond. So the need for this bridging from a really wide range of knowledge bases to those making important decisions that affect many people's lives is in large part what gripped me and encouraged me to continue my own studies, to come to Cambridge as a PhD student, and to try to understand policy challenges more deeply in order to address them more effectively and improve outcomes. So now I'll say a little bit about my own trajectory. There we go. I started out as a researcher here, as many do, reading way beyond my prescribed reading list. Sorry, David, my former supervisor is in the room. I couldn't help myself going quite far beyond my field. But many of us do, let's face it. And one of the things I encountered in that wider reading was the growing evidence about the relationship between maternal depression and children's outcomes, children's educational outcomes and attainment. And there was growing evidence from, major longitudinal studies and wider empirical research that made a compelling case that the relationship was systematic and very significant and not good. So I asked someone I knew who was already getting more involved with policy than I was at the time, how people making decisions about education, about young children's education, would learn about that finding and try to build it into policy. And the answer that came back was, well, they will learn about it, but it will take a while, and it might even take a couple of years as this research makes it out of academic journals into wider public understanding. So I was a bit concerned about that and pretty surprised, actually, because I was thinking, well, so many young children are going to be starting out in school, having come through really difficult starts in life, and they'll be missing out on what we could otherwise put in place that would help support them to do that better. So that gap between the important knowledge and the life-changing decisions it should inform felt like one of the most important areas problems that I personally could work on. And that's where I sort of was driven ever since. So I moved from academia to RAND, as Rob said, RAND Europe here in Cambridge, which is an independent, not-for-profit policy research organization. It's where foundations, government departments, and the European Commission come and bring some of their really hard questions and hope that researchers across a range of disciplines and in partnership with the various academics will help to answer them. I focused on justice and home affairs. I built a program of research there. But one of the things I learned at RAND, at least as important as any of the actual kind of findings of the studies we did, was actually how to help shape the questions and the analyses in ways that policymakers, decision makers, and operational folks would actually find useful. So a colleague who also works in this bridging space has said to me that there are two main kinds of questions. There are the kinds of questions that researchers ask, which are often about why. Why does this happen? Why is there more of this than of that? Well, lots of why questions. And the kinds of questions that decision makers ask, which is, so what? How will knowing that help me do something better and different, and that will improve outcomes if I do? So I learned an enormous amount about how to work with policymakers rather than simply at or to them or for them, but actually kind of with, and to draw in expertise across a really wide range of disciplines to do so. So then, at King's College London, and across many institutions, it was not unique to King's, but King's was a very early and fast mover on this, the introduction of impact into the REF in 2014 created a really strong new impetus for the kind of bridging work I had been focused on. I went to lead the research at the Policy Institute at King's and then the Institute itself as a space that was really explicitly designed to bring together rigorous research with policymakers' questions and to actually build long-term relationships, bringing in policymakers as fellows and visiting folks as well, so that we could really build the sustained relationships that make that more possible over time. And then a few years into that role, UKRI brought all the research councils together with Innovate UK. And they brought it all together under one umbrella with an explicit ambition following the nurse review to make sure that interdisciplinary work was done much more systematically and to make sure that it was really harnessed where possible to help address government's questions. So this was an exciting thing to do. I thought actually I got offered the role after quite a long process, a tough one, but I thought that actually bringing my knowledge to bear about how I'd been doing that in kind of at institutional level would be an interesting next step, and I was hoping to be able to help. I saw my role leading the Research Council as to support the deep substrate of basic research, really building the state of knowledge in the economic, social, behavioral, and psychological sciences and more that I was looking after. But also to ensure that that knowledge could be harnessed to inform policy and address societal challenges. You're seeing a theme, probably. One of the bridging mechanisms that was evolving at the time and gaining a lot of traction was the areas of research interest, the ARIs. Government departments created lists of questions that they thought the research landscape could help them answer. So I saw these starting to come out and thought that's brilliant. I really want to encourage researchers to work in this space. And I asked my teams in the SRC how many of these research questions actually need, that government needs answering, actually fall within our council's space. The answer was pretty striking, and I remember talking to Patrick Vallance about it. So the next thing I knew, Government Office for Science was doing their own analysis because obviously, vested interests and all that. So Government Office for Science did their own analysis of this, and the answer they came back with was really striking. It was that 2/3 of those government research questions sat within the Economic and Social Research Council's remit. 2/3. Well, that finding led momentum to a whole series of things that I then undertook with the council and in collaboration with Government Office for Science, the Government Chief Scientific Advisor, government departments, and Number 10, setting up fellowships, setting up cross-pollinating programs of work that would make sure that we were strengthening the bridge that would allow us to better answer some of those questions. And then a few years in, I had just agreed to a second term as Executive Chair of the Economic and Social Research Council when the Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor role came up. So despite strong cautions by many against leaving what a lot of people would consider to be the best possible position and working with a brilliant head of UKRI at the time, I was also encouraged by some of those I'd been starting to work with on Whitehall during that time. But it was going to be hard to resist because I had spent years working on policy questions at RAND on justice, home affairs, and security. I'd led the research council that was largely responsible for at least a lot of those questions. And although it was a really daunting prospect, it was also a compelling one to actually bridge the gap that I had identified by going to work directly with ministers. So I did that. But it was 2020 when I was making the decision. So the first wave of COVID was a really significant shock to the research landscape. ESRC, before I left, was called upon to fund an entire year's worth of research in 9 weeks. And we did it, thanks to brilliant teams and a fantastic council, all of that, and a lot of the collaboration with the Government Chief Scientific Advisor and departmental CSAs as well, because we needed to do a lot of prioritizing. So when the call came, I leapt in. It was the second wave of COVID when I did so, into an enhanced role as Director General for the Science, Technology, Analysis, and Data and Analytical Systems, as well as the Chief Scientific Advisor Science Advice role itself. following, of course, at the time in the very, very substantial footsteps of Cambridge's own Sir John Aston, now back here doing further great work. So, this next bit, the time, oh, that hasn't worked. No, once more. All right, let's try this one. Yes, okay. So part 3, the CSA role. This is a little bit about what it entailed, how it worked. Often didn't, but there we go. When I was going through the selection process in the summer of 2020, the guidance from the Government Office for Science described CSAs as having the role of licensed dissident. Okay, I really liked that phrase. I've always liked that phrase, hence invoking it in the title. But I think it probably merits a little bit of explanation. I'm sure it made everybody in the Home Office nervous when I said that's what I was going to give a talk on. But anyway, and the person who's led the Home Office in the room had a good chuckle about that. So for many, dissident evokes the idea of a kind of outspoken public challenger, of the expert who goes to the press, the rebel voice outside the tent. The way I read it at the time, that's not really my inclination. For those of you who don't know me well, despite appearances of being in the spotlight here for 45 minutes, I tend not to seek it out. But the way I read it at the time, it was much more subtle and structural and actually quite significant, which was about the relative independence of the chief scientific advisor role within Whitehall, the license to operate as a roving challenge function, the encouragement to ask in any meeting, in any conversation, why are we doing this? What's the evidence for this? Is there something we haven't considered? That is a distinctive role in Whitehall. Now, civil servants in the room will obviously protest, and of course, all civil servants are encouraged to bring challenge and to draw on evidence when they do so. But it seems valuable, and I think the history indicates as much, to have some designated voices in the room whose careers, whose incentives, whose knowledge base are actually outside the civil service, with access to a wider range of expertise than would normally be available to many of those in departments, and whose actual job it is to make sure those questions are asked and ideally answered. So, a little bit about what the role entails. I would just highlight 3 core functions, at least that I found, the sort of overarching ones, would be advising and challenging ministers and senior officials on science and evidence, building, supporting, and being supported by scientific advisory councils to do so, and connecting to the wider science and evidence system, both internally in the department, but also across Whitehall, across the research landscape in the UK and internationally. There was a lot of that too. Now, I guess this bit is what you're seeing here on the slides. People have often asked me over the years, but what science actually happens in the Home Office? And they ask it with a bit of incredulity, as I've tried to imitate just there. But so I will say a little bit about it, because I think it may not seem obvious. It's not the bits you see in the news so much. And in fact, under my time at the Home Office, I was very keen that it not be the bit that you saw in the news. So science in the Home Office is kind of everything from the physics of ballistics to the chemistry of wastewater analysis, from the engineering of building safety and protecting large public gatherings from attack, to the psychology of violence fixation. From forensic science and the use of AI, for example, for pulling fingerprints off a balled up piece of tape, very cool, to the social psychology of online harms, or the history and sociology of organized crime. So it really spans the gamut. The department also has a very distinguished history in developing rigorous social measurement. The Crime Survey for England and Wales, which was originally called the British Crime Survey, built on intellectual foundations from the US, from the Netherlands, and from Canada, and became a really world-class research instrument. I was very aware of it when I was doing my work, certainly, and the idea of going to do science in the Home Office seemed very exciting, partly because of this. So it's providing an independent measure of crime that police-recorded statistics can't do. And that's because, of course, police-recorded statistics tell us as much about the funding and the priorities and the reporting that the public does to the police of that crime as it does about, or more about that than it does about what's actually happening in the population. Now, I wasn't there when that was developed, but the wastewater analysis work I mentioned earlier is in a similar vein. One of the things I was really lucky to get to work on during my time at the Home Office was the development of an enhanced surveillance and early warning system for synthetic opioids. This was announced at the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs in Vienna, and it uses wastewater analysis alongside other kinds of data feeds from emergency responders and so on to track the presence and the strength of drugs in the system in the UK. It's an early warning capability that was developed at a time when it was really a great concern to avoid a US-style fentanyl crisis. This was in 2021. More than 3/4 of the 100,000 fatal overdoses that happened in the US from drugs involved synthetic opioids. And fentanyl is up to 50 times more potent than heroin, and nitazines, of which we've already had a few deaths in the UK, can be even more powerful still. So wastewater data is like the crime survey in a way, although even more so, a really truly independent measure, not of what police are seizing and testing, but of what's actually circulating in the wider population. So that's incredibly important, because it actually is one of the only ways, if not the only way, that we can tell when there are operations or new policies or interventions, are we actually having any impact on what's happening in the population? We can't tell that just from seizures and arrests and things. The science runs from the chemistry, as I said, of what can be detected, through the epidemiology of population-level inference, to questions that are social and behavioral, which communities are most exposed and why, how does the knowledge of a new drug spread through a using population, and indeed, as I said, what kinds of interventions are working or have worked. The translation space there between technical detection capability and effective public health and policing response is definitely not a footnote to the chemistry in that. It's where the policy actually kind of lives or dies. And so it is across Home Office activity in countering extremism, in border security and immigration, in policing, public safety. In every area, there's science, data, and evidence that can help. So that's a little bit of the what. The dog there actually is just my favorite of all the kinds of things I did, was always the training of the sniffer dogs. I didn't train them, but I got to go and see how it worked and ask them really difficult questions about how they made sure that the dogs didn't die from sniffing something that was so powerful and that sort of thing, which mattered a lot to me. I think in terms of the how of how you get science advice sort of undertaken in a way that it can be trusted and provided in a way that it can be useful is at least as important as the what, because again, it's that translation space. It lives or dies there. And there are some in the room who know at least as much about this as I do, so slightly where angels fear to tread. But it's still something very much that I and others who have worked in this space that I know have been wanting to continue to learn about and improve. It's an evolving practice, if you like. So, I don't know, it's possibly at the level of practice a bit less widely discussed than some of the kind of evidence base or the kind of theoretical work on how you get evidence into policy, and that's a rich literature already in itself, which possibly some in the room and certainly some at Cambridge and beyond are working on. This is a little bit less widely discussed and probably falls into more of what Irving Goffman would have called being a chief scientific advisor. So this is definitely more limited than the kind of rich scholarly literature I've just alluded to. It's reflections from practice, from inside the system. And again, it's not arrived at through a well-replicated and carefully designed randomized controlled trial, but through throwing myself into the frying pan, or maybe it was even the fire sometimes. So there are observations offered in the hope that they might be useful to whoever comes next, because whoever comes next is obviously going to be in the business of testing what I'm saying and refuting or refining the lessons from it. And the first thing I'm going to say, which is sounds like an absolute truism, I think, but is true. It's genuinely worth investing really seriously in getting to know people. So getting to know them and their challenges, frankly. So it's obviously almost certainly the case in any workplace, in any place at all, really, because we are human and we come together and get to know each other, and that builds all kinds of good things. But it's especially true in a very busy government department, where ministers are the recognized leaders and articulators of requirements to the system. But they're also people with concerns, preoccupations, their own ideas about what's working and what isn't working. Getting to know people, spending time when you pass by their offices, finding out how they think it's going, whether they think there's a problem, if there's anything you could help with. That was some of the best moments for impact in my time in the 5 years, was actually just stopping and saying, did you get that submission? Is there anything you want to talk about on it? Anything else I can help with? Sometimes that just spark of connection allows a kind of a real, proper discussion at the right moment. And understanding people's challenges, taking responsibility for issues, keeping sight of the sheer scope of what's crossing ministerial desks at any given time. Hundreds of things going across all the desks in ministerial offices. And realizing that, and helping my teams realize, this was a very hard one, but really important lesson, that sending something into an office, an email, a submission, or whatever, is absolutely, completely different from someone receiving it, processing it, understanding it, and doing something with it. And it's people going and saying, did you get this? Is there anything I can explain about it? Is there anything more we can do on this? That really makes a difference between whether something lands or whether it actually sort of gets lost in the fray, sometimes. So what worked best for me, I think, was shaped by the licensed dissident framing. Being confident, which for me entailed making sure that I had all the expertise, the knowledgeable experts behind me. They say it takes a village to raise a child. I think it takes a village of academics and experts to help a CSA do their role. That was, as you've gathered from the huge breadth of areas that were covered, absolutely crucial. While also being very, very explicit about the limits of what's known and how those limits might be addressed. Because just saying, well, we know this, but we don't know that, and then stopping there is sort of like, but I need to know that. So then what can we do about it? Articulating uncertainty, being really careful to do so in a way that opens up options rather than paralyzes. You can't just say, well, we don't know the answer, right? You've got to say, we don't know the answer, but what we know from here and from there, and where there's something else that we're learning next that will be helpful soon, for example. Fan diagrams rather than point estimates, scenarios rather than predictions. Some of these things became increasingly useful, I think, and understood in COVID as being a way to help people understand issues and work in the uncertainty that was so important. And then also, of course, being a problem solver rather than a blocker, explaining when and why caution is warranted on something, but always showing a way to be able to move forward with it nonetheless, with caution. So Patrick Vallance had a framing about COVID restrictions, which I found really striking at the time during SAGE and discussions beyond. He said that to be effective at stopping the spread, restrictions might need to go harder, wider, and faster than you think is needed. I adapted this a bit from my own thinking about science advice more generally. Go harder on the challenge, do the challenge you need to do. Go wider for the expertise and perspectives that you need to bring in for that. And move faster than researchers certainly tend to think even is possible. Even to the point of, and I think this was a really important feature on a few occasions, trying to anticipate before receiving a commission, hearing something in the news, seeing something that was going on in the world and saying, oh, ministers will be wondering about X or Y, here's how we can help, and getting teams to mobilize around something so that you're actually moving with the pace of the questions and the decision environment rather than always feeling slightly behind it. As you can imagine, if you want to do this, system readiness is really, really important. So this is where it was both fantastic and a huge responsibility to be the DG as well, because you really need to make sure that you've got the expert contacts kept warm, that you've got advisory councils already built and well-functioning, ideally with many people on speed dial, that you've got the relationships with your teams internally in a place that means that they trust you when you start to say, we really do need to get going on this, let's get ahead of it. And they trust your judgment on pace and on the needs that you're articulating. And then, of course, relationships with ministers and officials built carefully over enough time to give you the latitude to take a minute, or sometimes even 2 or maybe 3, to get things right rather than just get them done and get them in. So, you may be wondering this kind of mystery set of words in the title that is a pairing. I'll say a little bit about dissidence and empathy, which might seem an unlikely pair otherwise. But you'll have gathered that the licensed dissident is the person whose institutional role harks back to some of what was missing in the earlier story, as well as what the guidance indicates. But it is the case that the person who asks very challenging questions and surfaces assumptions without thinking about the decision environment in which they're landing, there's a risk that you become an irritant to bat away or a blocker to sidestep. I felt on many occasions I was walking this particular tightrope. So that's where I would suggest that empathy can come in. And when I say empathy, I don't mean the abandonment of rigor or anything like that, or independence. I mean, I guess, what some people might call modeling the decision environment, understanding the context into which you're delivering a question. So thinking about the information constraints in a busy office, the attention economy, if you like. There's going to be so many competing things, pressures that shape which questions can even seem feasible. If there's no money to do something, then saying that this really expensive thing will work is going to feel problematic. That doesn't mean you don't do it, but you have to be aware of that when you do. And then, of course, the one that I think I have not heard people talk about so much at all either is the personal circumstances that might affect somebody's, patience or attention, or even ability to hear what you're saying after a bad start to the day, which I'm sure ministers as well as officials as well as everybody else have sometimes. But people tend to forget because it's such important jobs they're doing. You just think, we're always going to be on it. Clausewitz wrote in the 19th century about the fog of war, the irreducible uncertainty and confusion that pervades military operations in which decisions are made and nonetheless have to still be made. So I couldn't help it sometimes in the Home Office, and I see 1 or 2 people smiling, but it seemed to me that the daily work of a department of 60,000 people under persistent media and parliamentary scrutiny can actually feel like that fog of war in everyday institutional life. Never all the information you would like, never all the time you would like to obtain more of it. And in that environment, surely the goal is not a perfect or conclusive answer, but some useful clearing of the fog that might reduce down the problem space and enable a bit of action. And then, of course, continuing to test and see whether that was the right thing and improve it if needed. But waiting for certainty risks missing the moment while speaking with humility, I guess, and usefully into uncertainty, has a strong chance of actually having some usefulness in informing decisions and building trust as well, actually. And trust, in turn, once established, I found also smooths a great deal of this. It's so hard to earn trust quickly in a noisy room when there's lots of things going on, but built over time, through trusted decisions that turn out to be right, advice that turns out to have worked or been helpful or cleared the fog, really does mean that it buys you a bit of latitude, if you like, to break in when it's needed and to actually make a difference sometimes when you might otherwise not. And that's back to getting to know people again, actually. So a few takeaways. Nope, that's the one that doesn't work. I will learn eventually. There we go. So the first is obviously no surprise, design in both challenge and diversity of thought. In the institutional architecture, not as an afterthought. When Patrick Vallance gave evidence to the COVID-19 inquiry, he noted that SPI-B, the behavioral science subgroup of SAGE, had been a really important innovation, but that it might not necessarily be the right permanent structure for ongoing behavioral and social advice for other kinds of emergencies. And he described a group recently established to look across national emergencies and ask, What is the social and behavioral science evidence base likely to be required in different scenarios? How should you commission research in advance to be better prepared? And what needs to happen both inside and outside government to get it right? I was asked to establish and lead that cross-Whitehall group, and then I also set up a funding group so that there would actually be funding to do some of the things that we were identifying. It felt very worthwhile, kind of trying to build in structurally some of what the Lindman story showed was absent. The systematic anticipatory interrogation of the behavioral and social data and understanding we needed to effectively plan and respond to crises and questions, indeed to deliver policy aims at all. So building that habit of bringing a fuller picture, a fuller range of disciplines into the picture and plurality of thought early on, that should be both in how government commissions research and innovation, how universities design programs, and how advisory bodies are constituted. That seems really important in reducing this gap between the UK's research excellence and its translation to actual outcomes for people. The second is empathic dissidence, and just very briefly on this one. Reading the room, to me, isn't a concession or a compromise. In some instances, it's what makes a challenge effective rather than just principled. And the goal is not comfortable advice delivered with sensitivity, but it's also not uncomfortable truths delivered so that they go unheard, in a manner to be unheard. It's rigorous, independent, genuinely challenging advice, communicated with enough understanding of the person and the moment that it has the best possible chance of making a difference. And that's really hard to design into how everything is structured, how CSA roles are structured, how advisory councils are constituted, but it is the aim. And I think also, and again, this is where I'm hoping in my new role I can help with this, in how we train and develop people to work across this bridge, because so much of this is so actually interpersonal and relational. And the students I've been seeing as the fast stream has been coming through our organization, our School for Government at King's, is that they really want to get into the detail of the how, like this. And the third and last one is invest in the range of research and practice to deepen the substrate. This one's a little bit different but related. So where the knowledge base or substrate, as I call it, is deep and has been built empirically over time, longitudinal cohort studies I mentioned earlier, or empirical research on crowd behavior, government can draw on the science really quickly. It can see what the evidence is, and it's very reliable then when it needs to be put into action. And there are many of you in this room, I'm sure, who are working on things like that. But there are certainly still areas where the substrate is very thin, where causal questions have not been funded at sufficient scale or over sufficient time to give us robust, actionable answers when a crisis forces the question. I think there's a bit of a potential connection here to the Valley of Death, the gap in technology commercialization between a promising innovation and its successful adoption. Here I'm being provocative, but good ideas often fail in the Valley because I think the social and behavioral dimensions may not have been adequately taken into account. There's a growing literature, of course, about the importance of whether people understand, trust, take up and diffuse or use technology or the subject of policy like vaccines, AI, and many more of which are current today. I had an interesting meeting related to this when I went to DARPA, and I visited the Ethical, Legal, and Societal Implications team, affectionately known as ELSI there, during a trip to Washington. And they described how when they were first established, they worked with only a few of the projects in the portfolio. But they'd become increasingly busy over a short period of time, or a relatively short period of time, because it had been noticed that the projects they were working on were advancing much more quickly and effectively than many of the others. Now, not necessarily because the science was particularly better, we don't know, but they felt because the human and institutional dimensions had been taken seriously from the outset. And I say they felt, I think DARPA felt, not just the team itself, for that would be slightly suspect. So that was a really interesting sort of empirical case study, if you like. And the answer to me to a thin substrate, as we have in some areas, is not to avoid the question or to assume that common sense is going to have to be the answer. It's actually to look for adjacent data and evidence, to build the evidence base where we don't have it, and actually to test and learn and see if we can improve that evidence base over time. And we'll need to have sustained investment to do that. This was certainly the case in several areas of tackling violence against women and girls, which was one of the more recent things I worked on as well. As the evidence review for that, for the new government strategy made clear, it wasn't possible to currently, at least, find what works across all of the areas that really require intervention, that we really need to improve. But that doesn't mean we would do nothing. It means investing in innovation, and there's a new innovation fund to do that, and building the evidence that's needed. Because ultimately, in my view, that's an investment in knowing how to spend public money so that it has the best chance of being effective. So, closing point or two. I'll just come back to the thread that runs through and connects the story to where I began. The question of how governments use the full range of scientific expertise is one that here in the UK, as in some other countries, we've been grappling with for quite some time. And the formal government chief scientific advisor role was built partly in response to some of the lessons from the Lindemann period, lots of subsequent learning as well. And what's been constructed since then represents major progress. It's certainly since then, and is recognized actually internationally. I've been asked by many in other countries to help them understand the system. I was even asked to help establish a chief scientific advisor somewhere else. And it's definitely the case that understanding how these things work and trying to learn and do them well and do them together is not easy. And a lot of the knowledge, and Rob and I have talked about this, is sort of tacit. But knowledge, as John Van Reenen has eloquently said, walks on two legs. It doesn't just diffuse automatically. It can't just be designed into institutional travels. It travels in the researchers who spend time inside government and come back changed by that, in the officials who develop really strong relationships with those researchers and academic communities who work on the problems they face, and some of you in the room, so thank you, and in the good folk of people at CSaP and elsewhere who bring everyone together so that we can actually do that building and understanding. But also in scientists who join scientific advisory councils and bring not just expertise, but a determination to ask the questions that the system might otherwise miss, and in the people who become CSAs themselves. So I offer my own trajectory not as a kind of an example of something that worked, but as evidence that crossing boundaries and cultures like this, while it is really, really hard, I'm definitely not going to pretend otherwise, it's possible, and it's really, really fulfilling if you can do it. It changes how you see both research and policy, in my view, and it gives you a chance to carry back and forth across the bridge something very worthwhile that I hope will improve how we do things. The work my teams, colleagues, collaborators, and I did in the Home Office, from early warning systems, or the evidence base for Ukrainian migration, or the evidence synthesis that underpins the recent violence against women and girls strategy, it's really worthwhile. It's work that's undertaken by fantastic teams in there who are so keen to make a difference to these problems which they can see so keenly and see that they need work. So the question then becomes how we can actually sustain and learn from that work, how we can make the connection or the bridging between the research base and the policy process robust enough so that it can actually survive political cycles, survive changes of leadership, which we are seeing a fair number of as well, so that it's resilient enough to function even under great pressure, and so that it's broad enough in its disciplinary reach to ask the crucial questions that might be missed otherwise. And that's ultimately a sort of evolution of the point that C.P. Snow was arguing in 1961 and that Lisa Jardine was reminding us of in 2009. And to me, it remains, for me, the kind of driving question. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm really looking forward to a discussion.